This is Gary Stieber with a message from Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 21. Have you ever heard the saying that we make decisions and then our decisions turn around and make us? Well, this is certainly true of many people in the Bible, and it's certainly true in Daniel's case. And the same may be true for you and for me. The book of Daniel shows us that believers can live with integrity when tempted to compromise, and in chapter 1 we see that Daniel's integrity is established. John MacArthur describes Daniel as an uncompromising life in a compromising world, and that's a great description. And the question, of course, is uncompromising with regard to what? It's only good to be uncompromising if we're talking about the right things. We can be uncompromising in regard to a lot of things that we need to be flexible on. Ray Stedman says, if you're working in a company that's surrounded by a godless crowd who are taking the name of God in vain every moment, and who agrees with the ideas and the attitudes of the world and its ways, and who makes fun of the things of God, showing little interest in what God says to mankind, then I suggest that you read carefully the book of Daniel. That's Ray Stedman. Daniel shows us how to live and how to act and how to carry ourselves in such a way that God will use us and bless us. And it shows us how to honor God in a world that just doesn't. Let me ask you a question. Does that sound like a message that we need to hear today? And we're going to see that integrity goes deeper than our words. Integrity means having strong values and living by them through every circumstance. And through studying the book of Daniel, we're going to learn from a man with integrity who could withstand any kind of challenge. And this is the same chart from our study in the book of Ezekiel. Daniel is one of three captivity prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel being the other ones. They lived in the same time periods, but they had different audiences and different circumstances. Daniel was captured in the first of three deportations of the Israelites by the Babylonians in 605 BC. And Daniel was held in the royal courts, so that's the primary setting of the book. And you can go back to the study in Ezekiel if you'd like to get more detail on this slide here. Now, when the Israelites were captured by the Babylonians, there are anecdotal stories that have been handed down. They're not recorded in Scripture, but they're handed down orally that states that during the exile, there were some Jews who wanted to take the Scriptures that they knew along with them at the time. And to their credit, the Babylonians didn't refuse them the right to take the Scriptures because they didn't want to bring the wrath of the Hebrew God upon them. Now, the Scriptures at that time were long rolls. So rather than refusing them the right to bring the Scriptures along with them, they decided to make it hard for them to do it. The Babylonians took these Scriptures, they cut them up, and they sewed them together to form bags or sacks, and then they filled them with sand and gave them back to the Jews. And they told them, hey, look, you want to carry the Scriptures? Fine. Carry your Scriptures. Here they are. Carry them as they are. So now they had to walk from Jerusalem to Babylon. And it wasn't possible to travel in a straight line because you'd be moving across the open desert. So the normal travel route would take you north, and then you'd follow water sources along the way. And this trip ended up being something like 900 miles in length, carrying the Scriptures loaded with sand. Now, this is a map that shows you the travel route from Jerusalem to Babylon. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, okay, I see the map here, but I can't really relate to that. If we take that same route and impose it on the same scale, we get a better sense of what we're talking about here. This would be a trip roughly the equivalent as walking from Houston to Birmingham, Alabama, by the way of Oklahoma and Fort Smith, Arkansas, with your suitcase that doesn't have wheels filled with sand. Now, we know from our study in Ezekiel that the Israelites were exiled largely because they weren't closely following God. Well, clearly there were some people who were very dedicated to God, dedicated enough to carry their Scriptures loaded as a bag full of sand 900 miles. Think about that for a minute. Now, we can tell something about the book by looking at the words that are commonly used in the theme of the book. Now, the most commonly used word in the book of Daniel is shall or will, depending on what version you use. The word shall appears 227 times in the ESV. Now, being prophetic in nature, Daniel is largely a book about the things that shall come or things that will come. And the description of the things to come is in the last half of the book. The word shall occurs 227 times. 186 of those are in chapters 7 through 12, and 123 times in chapter 11 alone. Daniel gives us history before it happens. And Daniel describes events hundreds of years in the future with such precision that many people, when they come across it, they thought that it had to be written hundreds of years later than it actually was. They thought it was a history book rather than a prophetic book. That's how precise many of the activities that he records are. The second most common word used in the book of Daniel is the word king. Now, before all the things that shall come or will come, the first part of the book is dominated by an earthly king. And the word king appears 173 times, and 144 of those are in the first 6 chapters, 51 in chapter 2 alone. There's a heavy emphasis on the fact that Daniel is now in a land dominated by an earthly king who is the focal point of everyone, and he controls everything. Daniel is a little bit like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, who recognizes that we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. Now, what comes in between those two things? The theme of the book is stated in chapter 4, verse 17, and again in chapter 5, verse 21. And that is that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. It might look like the earthly king is in charge, and it looks that way from everything that we can see. And if the king wants you to eat the best food, it's your job to just go along and eat the food, right? Well, not if you serve the Most High who rules in the kingdom of men. Now, we're just going to take a few minutes and summarize the first 7 verses of chapter 1. And we're going to find out that Daniel lives out the words of the prophet Jeremiah. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. This is a grow where you're planted kind of a message, and that's what Daniel does. We're told that in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7. Now, Daniel must have been a person of some promise before the captivity, or he wouldn't have been taken in the first round of captivity, and he wouldn't have found himself in the king's court upon captivity. We're told in Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, that the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. But their plan isn't to educate them necessarily as much as it is to teach them to be Babylonians, and much could be said about that. Now, Daniel was likely a teenager, maybe around 15 years or so. He was a future leader in Israel. And in verse 5, we're told that the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank, and that they were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. So here's the picture. Daniel and his 3 friends, they're captured. Everything they had is taken away from them, and they're going to be re-educated and re-socialized and repurposed. They're to be thoroughly converted to Babylonian ways, including language, literature, religion, and diet. He's going to serve nobility. He's no longer going to be nobility. And the training here isn't like Army basic training where you're yelled at by a drill sergeant and you eat down in the mess hall. The idea here is that for people at this level, with this sort of skill, the Babylonians would seduce you into their culture. They would say, look how great this palace is. Look how great the life is. And look how great the food is. Look how great an opportunity is before you. Isn't being one of us better than anything you've ever known before? And to be sure, if you're going to be taken into captivity, there's a lot worse places that you could be. David Jeremiah says this, Daniel and his 3 friends are going to be educated in a highly sophisticated but deeply pagan environment. Now let me ask you a question. Does the idea of being seduced into conformity sound a lot like the world that we live in today? Now in verses 6 and 7, we're told that Daniel and his 3 friends were given new names. And all 4 of these gentlemen had very strong Hebrew God-honoring names. Daniel's name means God is my judge. His name was changed to Belteshazzar, which means Bel, protect my life. Hananiah's name means Yahweh has been gracious. But his name is changed to Shadrach, which is a little bit uncertain, but it may mean illuminated by Aku. Mishael's name means who is as God. His name was changed to Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. And Azariah's name means helped of God, or Jehovah has helped. His name was changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. Now their names are all changed to reflect the names of the gods of Babylon. Bel, Aku, and Nebo are all gods of Babylon. And we've seen in a previous lesson that the name means something to people in the Bible. And to take the name away from a Jew would be a very degrading thing to do. Now let's pick it up at chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. Note the word resolve there. The phrase means that he set it upon his heart, and this expression indicates a careful, thoughtful decision. This wasn't an emotional decision, and it wasn't lightly made. It was purposeful, and he was devoted to the principle. He was committed to a specific course of action. Rod Mattoon says that he wouldn't be swayed by the pressures around him or by popular appeal. And he says he would not defile himself. The word defile means polluted or unclean, speaking largely in a ceremonial sense. And notice the phrase, the king's food. There's a couple of points here. As stated earlier, the word king is used heavily in the early chapters. And with regard to the word food, there are at least 3 Hebrew words that are translated as food, but none of those are used here. The word that's used here is pronounced pathbag, and Daniel's the only one to use it, and he uses it 8 times. So it's an unusual word. The word means the portion of food for the king. Now, I think there's a couple of ideas here in that. This is special food. It's delicacies, and there's a sense that Daniel is describing it as king's food of the king. It's the king's king food. It's not ordinary food, but king food. And it's not just king food, but it's the king's king food. There seems to be a double emphasis on the king. Now, think about lobster, for example. Lobster and all shellfish, they're prohibited under the Mosaic law. And not only that, but it would also be a delicacy, and especially if you live in a desert. It would be king food for sure. And not only that, but a lobster dinner, using that as an example, prepared for the king, would be an extraordinarily special meal. It would be king food prepared for the king. Now, I don't know if they had lobster there or not, but you follow my example. This isn't prison rations, and it isn't army rations. This is truly unique food. And we're not told exactly how Daniel would be defiled by eating the food, but it would certainly pertain to the Mosaic law at a minimum, and it likely contained foods that were not allowed, like pork, for example. And the food was also likely dedicated to a foreign god, which might be the reference here to the portion for the king, the other portion being dedicated to a god, perhaps. And this whole notion of food being dedicated to idols comes up 600 years later in the New Testament. It comes up in Acts chapter 15, Acts chapter 21. It comes up in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and so on. Now, it's worth our while to dig into the what, the why, the how, and the when of verse 8. The what is, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. You see, this isn't really about food. It's something much bigger than that. He's setting a standard here, and a standard isn't about food per se. The standard is, I won't do anything that defiles me in front of my God. Look, you can do anything you want to me. You can take all my stuff. You can change my name. You can make me learn your culture or whatever. But I cannot knowingly and willingly go against the desires of my God. Dave Guzik says it like this: Daniel realized that his relationship with God touched upon every area of his life, including what he ate. And as believers, we should be able to intelligently explain our desire to live a holy life pleasing to God when we are asked to compromise on the standards that God gives us. And I see a couple of points in that. It allows for the opportunity for Daniel to educate them in his relationship with his God. And he can answer questions like, well, what do you mean by being defiled? What does that mean? How does eating fill in the blank? How does that defile you? Why would your God care about that? Is there anything else that might defile you? And today what we would call that an open door to witness to them. He's setting the stage for an open door to witness to them. And take that last question as an example. Is there anything else that might defile you? Well, as a matter of fact, there are. And it would make that next conversation on whatever the next topic happened to be far easier when it comes up. And 3 years in the University of Babylon, so to speak, surely would include courses in astrology and other pagan kinds of practices. And there would be opportunity here for Daniel to say, hey, look, we're studying stars, for example. Let me tell you about the one who made the stars and who controls the stars. He's opening the door to witness to them on an ongoing basis. Let's look at the why of what he's doing here. And certainly there's an element of food here, defiling himself, but the topic of sharing food and eating of meals turns out to be an important issue in the Bible. Joyce Baldwin says to share a meal was to commit oneself to friendship. It was a sign of covenant significance. And the defilement that he fears, not so much the ritual aspect, it's a moral defilement, arising from the subtle flattery of gifts and favors which entail hidden implications of loyal support. And we see people who operate on that basis in our world today. Gleason Archer says that by their refusal to disobey God, they prepare themselves for future greatness as true witnesses for the one true God in the midst of a degenerate pagan culture. And it's significant precisely in the matter of forbidden food in which Satan successfully tripped up Adam and Eve all the way back in the garden. And Satan tried to trip up Jesus when he said, "Turn these stones to bread" in the temptation. So the issue is bigger than food. And Elizabeth Elliot said, "Does it make any sense at all to pray for guidance about the future if we're not obeying in a thing that lies before us today? How many momentous events in Scripture depend upon one person's seemingly small act of obedience?" And she says, "Rest assured, do what God tells you to do now and depend upon it, and you'll be shown what to do next." So there's a lot of depth to the why of what's going on here. Now let's look at the how. Daniel asks a respectful question with a respectful purpose in a respectful way. He doesn't demand his rights, he doesn't argue with them, and he doesn't bow up with attitude. Notice here that he doesn't ridicule them or their food, and he doesn't try to change their diet. He doesn't complain about the food, and he doesn't make it complicated by saying, "Look, call me when lamb is served, but not when pork is served," for example. Notice he doesn't complain about his situation. He doesn't say, "Hey, look, you guys took me from my homeland and you took everything I had and you changed my name and now this?" This isn't Daniel against the nation of Babylon. He doesn't point out all of the faults of the Babylonians. And notice that he doesn't challenge the chief. He doesn't announce to him that, "Hey, look, you know what? I'm an important person back home and you don't know who you're messing with." And he doesn't tell the chief that, "Hey, look, you know what? I'm an ambitious guy and one of these days I'm going to be your boss." He doesn't do any of that. And he doesn't hatch a scheme in private to try to manipulate the situation. And the other thing he doesn't do, he doesn't downplay the issue. He requests it candidly, but not harshly. And I think the when is also important here. He does this sometime before the meal, on the front end. He did it in advance, at the earliest opportunity. He doesn't wait for the dinner to be served to cause a great big scene and a great big spectacle once the meal's been served. Doing that would only cause hardship for the chief, so he avoids all of that. He avoids all of that in a respectful way. Now, verse 9, "And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age, so you would endanger my head with the king?" God gave Daniel favor and compassion. God's hand is responsible for establishing a favorable relationship with the chief eunuch. And this is the first of many occasions where Daniel is equipped by God to address a challenging situation. And note the word favor here. The word translated favor is the Hebrew word kesed. It's used 248 times in the Old Testament, so it's an important word. And depending on the Bible version you use, it's most often translated as loving kindness or steadfast love. David self describes it as the closest Old Testament term to the New Testament concept of grace. John Oswald describes it as a completely undeserved kindness and generosity, and it's not a love of feeling, but a love of action. And let's look at the word compassion. The word translated compassion there is racham. And it's the word for the womb, and it's most often translated in the Old Testament as mercy. It's the picture of a love that a mother has for her baby. Now, putting those two together, God granted Daniel favor and compassion, or what we might describe today as mercy and grace. This is as close to those New Testament concepts as you're going to get in the Old Testament. And notice he says, I fear my lord the king. See, the chief was sympathetic to Daniel, but Daniel's request puts him at risk, so he expresses his concern. Look, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. He and Daniel may have become friendly towards one another, but he still bears the responsibility to provide Nebuchadnezzar with well-fed young trainees. And here's the point. The chief fears the man, Daniel fears God. And that's a topic that plays out throughout the book of Daniel. And he says the king assigned your food and your drink. The food and the drink, they aren't a goodwill gesture. It's an assignment. It's been appointed to you. The word translated as sign could include a sense of counting or numbering, perhaps like an inventory. There's likely some record keeping involved. You see, the king is going to considerable trouble and expense to provide the absolute best for them. And the word your there, where he says your food and your drink, it's in the plural, and this applies to all of the four, not just to Daniel. And he asked the question, why should he see that you're in worse condition than the youths of your own age? The assumption here is that you would suffer physically by eating anything but the best, and that it would be clearly noticeable. And the image reminds me of those, survival game shows where you're in a remote spot with nothing to eat but what you can find to eat. It doesn't take long for the contestants to start to waste away physically. And he says, look, you would endanger my head. Because God had given Daniel mercy and grace, the chief doesn't pull rank on him, but he engages in conversation, giving Daniel the opportunity to find a solution here. But he's risking his life in doing so. Let me ask you a question. You think his life would really be at risk, or is this just hyperbole? Well, we're going to see people thrown into the fire and thrown into the lion's den, so his fear is legitimate. Verse 11, Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Now notice he's talking to the steward here, not the chief, but the steward. He says, test your servants. And Daniel again is speaking respectfully and humbly. And note 10 days here. Now 10 days isn't a very long time for a distinction to appear between the four and the rest who ate the best of what the king has to offer here. So Daniel knew that he would need God's blessing on this test. And the word vegetable there in verse 12 likely refers to anything that grows from seeds. And that would include fruit, vegetables, and even grains. And the king food would certainly include meat and all kinds of other things. So such a diet and drinking water only would make it simple for Daniel and his friends to maintain the Jewish dietary laws. And if the steward agrees to feed them this menu, Daniel and his friends could maintain their integrity to this aspect of the Jewish law. Note that this is not a mandate to become vegetarian, and I'm very glad personally to say that. And he says, observe our appearance. Our appearance will be measured for sure, but no doubt it will also include things like their alertness, their attentiveness, their energy level, and things like that. Verse 14, So he listened to them in this matter, and he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. The steward listened to them in this matter. The steward knew the reason why he was doing this. Daniel and his friends wanted to honor their God. And even if the test failed, Daniel and his friends would have provided a witness to him of their faith. But the word listen here implies that he followed up with action. And we're going to see that this test of their faith strengthens their faith. And notice that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh. Well, that doesn't sound like a compliment, does it? But there was a noticeable difference. And the word fatter here, it can mean fatter, but it can also mean firm or solid. Now, we've all seen the skinny little teenager who filled out and bulked up and maybe matured quickly, but not in 10 days. God would have not only had to deliver the final result, but he would have had to have accelerate the process here. Now, the same word that's translated fatter here is used in Genesis 41 in a similar concept. Remember the dreams of Pharaoh regarded the 7 filled-out cows and the 7 lean cows and the 7 full ears of grain and the 7 thin ears of grain? It's used in the same way here. Now, we all know that there's all kinds of diets in our world, right? There's low carb, there's no carb, there's Mediterranean, there's vegetarian, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, Daniel's diet wasn't so much a vegetarian diet as it was a faith diet, a diet meant to honor God. Verse 17, As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. You see, God gave them learning and skill. God gave them the knowledge and the understanding and the ability to apply the knowledge that they were given. And Daniel gets an extra measure of understanding in visions and dreams. God spoke through visions to people when they were awake, and he spoke in dreams to people when they were asleep. And today that sounds to us kind of an odd thing, but it becomes a prominent item later in the book of Daniel. Verse 18, and at the end of the time when the king had commanded them that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. When he says at the end of the time, he's talking about the end of that 3-year period, which is referenced in verse 5. And among them none was found like them. These trainees, they entered the royal court, and the king interviewed them, and we don't know what that interview process looked like, but at the end of the process, nobody was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we don't know how many people they were compared against, but when the king interviewed these 4, they stood out above all the rest. And the 4 didn't stand out because they had kept a good diet, but they stood out because God had blessed them for keeping his commands. And notice that the king inquired of them. In just 3 short years, the king now seeks them for knowledge and wisdom. And again, we're to bloom where we're planted here. Paul served in prison. Daniel served in captivity. And he says they're 10 times better. In Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, no one had greater respect from the king than Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the fact that they were Jewish undoubtedly caused a lot of consternation among the local Babylonian officials who would view them as outsiders. And this seems to be the reason behind their accusations that come up later in the book. The magicians and the enchanters, they represented the best that the pagan world had to offer, but God's servants surpassed them all. And both of those words, the magicians and the enchanters, imply the arts of the occult. And the occult are no match for the God of all creation. And we're told in verse 21 that Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. This would be Cyrus of Persia, who conquered Babylon in 539 BC, but Daniel continued as an official under the Persians. And the word until doesn't mean that that's when Daniel died. In Daniel chapter 10, verse 1, he refers to the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, which would be approximately 536 BC. And this is another slide we had from our Ezekiel study. Daniel lived to see the completion of the 70 years of exile in Babylon and the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy that the Jews would be allowed to return back to Jerusalem. And this would put Daniel into his mid to late 80s at that time. Daniel never makes it back to Israel, but he serves 4 or 5 kings in his time in Babylon. Okay, let's try to summarize this. We have a couple of expressions that we're familiar with today. We're surrounded with the notion that, hey, look, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. And of course, we're told that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And the idea here is that, hey, you know what? The people back home, they won't know what you're doing. And you know what? Everybody here is doing it, whatever it is. Let me ask you a question. Do you face temptation to compromise from biblical standards at work or from your friends? I mean, not crazy big compromises like stealing from your employer or something like that, but things that many people would just shrug off as unimportant. The Bible has a lot of stories where there is a clear contrast between good and evil, where the good is easy to see and the evil is easy to see. Here that issue comes up in a story about food, and it's easy to say, hey, come on, man, this isn't that big a deal. And of course, that's exactly the point. In Luke chapter 16, verse 10, we're told that one who is faithful in the very little is also faithful in much, and the one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. And the book of Daniel is about an uncompromising life in a compromising world, and the compromises comes in all shapes and forms. But there should be nothing that would make us compromise what we know to be true and what we know to be the divine standard. Daniel faces the same kinds of challenges that every believer of every age faces, to obey the command of God and not be conformed to this world. Romans chapter 12 verse 2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." See, Daniel was in Babylon, but he wouldn't let Babylon get in him. We're to be in the world, but not of the world. And when you honor God, he will use you and bless you. And 2,600 years later, we know that what happens in Babylon, it doesn't stay in Babylon. And Les P. Bruce describes a reoccurring pattern in the book of Daniel. He says there are a series of stories that have 3 participants: the earthly king or his representatives, God's servants, now that's primarily Daniel or his three friends, and God himself, whether specifically mentioned or not. And in many of these events, the sovereignty of the earthly king is undermined in some way, and God's servants are honored, and God is credited with the outcome. And in that we see that God is above the earthly king or the earthly gods. And in this story, the king's orders weren't followed, but God gave Daniel and his three friends favor. And they were found to be 10 times better than the wisest people in Babylon in wisdom and understanding. These 4 were very wise, and Daniel was given an extra measure of understanding of visions and dreams. And we're told twice here that all of that is a result of God giving crucial elements. Favor and compassion in verse 9, and wisdom and understanding in verse 17. God chips away at the world through our obedience to him. And Kenneth Osbeck says, we're a lot like the exiles, at least in one sense. The book of Daniel is really a textbook of instruction and example of how God's people can live in difficult conditions and come through victoriously. And the Jewish people were living in Babylonian captivity. And today Christians are pilgrims and sojourners in a foreign culture. You see, Daniel's story is our story. And we, like Daniel and his friends, we have to exercise our faith in God's purposes and leading for our lives. We need to resolve in advance that we will not be defiled by the world, and that we need to express that in a respectful way. And God may or may not make us the smartest people in the class, but he will reward us for honoring him. You see, Daniel and his friends personify for us Christian courage at its best. You see, there's the kind of courage that causes us to step in when we see a robbery happening. And there's a different kind of courage that enables us to live in a Christ-like manner every day, whether anyone sees it or not. It takes courage to be in the unpopular minority when truth and right are involved. And it takes courage to defend God's name when everyone else is using it in blasphemy. And it takes courage to be another Daniel in a godless society. And God is still seeking people who by faith will dare to prove his greatness and will represent him courageously, regardless of the circumstances. Those are the words of Kenneth Osbeck. And finally, let's keep in mind that Daniel was a teenager, far from home, separated from everything that was familiar to him. Everything in his life has changed. He's exposed to a lot of foreign thinking. The environment is deeply worldly, with no interest in the things of God whatsoever. The food is different. Everything he believes is going to be challenged, and they even gave him a new nickname. And he's going to see a lot of things designed to seduce him into conforming to the way of the land. And his faith and his values, they're going to be tested like he's never seen before. Now let me ask you a question. What does that picture remind you of? Well, it reminds me a lot of today's college and university environment. And what we see here is that somebody did a magnificent job in preparing Daniel for the real world. Are you a person in your teens? Then this message is especially for you. And the Babylonians could change a lot of things about Daniel, but they couldn't change his character. And there would certainly be some peer pressure here for sure. And without question, many of his peers would have said, hey, come on, man, don't rock the boat for the rest of us. Just eat the food, for crying out loud. It's terrific. Peer pressure often comes from people that we really like or admire. And the world is pressuring you to either go along or be regarded as irrelevant. R.W. DeHaan says it this way: look at a river from above, either by air or on your online map source. There are no straight rivers. They all meander along the way. Why? Well, water follows the path of least resistance. They flow around anything that blocks their eroding work. Rivers are crooked because they take the easy way, and Christians can become crooked for the same reason. When we fail to overcome the seduction from all of the nice-looking, shiny new things in the world, we can deviate from the straight path that God would have us follow. And we saw in our study of Ezekiel that God treasures personal accountability, and at some point we have to own our own faith. The world isn't going to draw you close to God. Everything in the world draws you away from God, and we have to view the university mindset with a biblical mindset. In Daniel, we see faithfulness rewarded with influence and with insight and wisdom that you just wouldn't have without the Spirit of God living inside of you. So we need to draw close to God individually, and we need to draw close to God as part of a family in a local church for support. And if you're a parent or a grandparent of a young person, then this message is especially for you too. You see, somebody did a terrific job in preparing Daniel growing up, and as a grandparent, you can have massive influence on a child. And as a parent, you are your child's primary educator, and you might not teach them about engineering or medicine or anything like that, but what you can teach them about how to view the world is far more valuable than all of that. And that's the message that I have for you from Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 8 through 11. And I look forward to our next time together.